Today on Bennett's Slice of Life, it's an economic show. I'm going to be talking about inflation, its history, the circulation of money in the economy and how that works, and something people are calling the silent depression, which means we are in a depression in 2024 that is worse than our forefathers faced in 1930 at the height of the Great Depression. And no one is talking about it. All that and more on Bennett's Slice of Life. Hit it. Welcome to Bennett's Slice of Life. As I said, today is going to be an economic show. So the first question I have is, what is inflation? Well, thanks to a website called Investopedia, they create these short little videos that, again, explain things way better than I can. Here is their explanation of what inflation is.
Inflation is the increase in prices of goods or services over time. Dan just got paid and needs to buy groceries. Dan heads to the grocery store and loads up his cart with the items that he needs. These items cost Dan a total of $100. A year later, Dan returns to the grocery store with $100 to purchase the same items. However, now the same items cost $105 and Dan is forced to remove an item from his cart. Dan has experienced the effects of a 5% inflation rate. Dan must pay $5 extra to purchase the same items that cost $100 only a year ago. Inflation leads to higher prices and lower purchasing power. It's usually a monetary phenomenon caused by a country printing more money than is justified by the country's wealth. When more dollars are issued for a limited amount of assets, the value of each dollar is decreased. Many countries' central banks set an inflation rate target of 2 to 3% per year.
Thanks to Investopedia's little video explanation, which did a better job than I could, the key point there was that inflation is caused by a country printing up more money than is justified by the country's wealth, and that the supply, as they increase more money supply by printing more bills, the value of each bill goes down and the purchasing power goes down. That is the key point there. When everybody got those stimulus payments that everybody was so happy with, the government had to print money or create money to pay that. They don't have a bank account like you or I have with money in it that they just write a check and pay things with. When they spend money, they have to actually print money that they then put into Treasury, and then the Treasury cuts checks on that money. See, you or I, we can't spend money we don't have. Well, we can. It's called a credit card. But generally speaking, if you live on a tight budget without credit cards, you cannot buy things when you don't have money. Well, basically, the government does that. They don't have money, but they buy things. They have this unlimited credit card, and the money is only worth what the government says it's worth. There's nothing backing up our money but the good faith of the United States government telling you that that $5 bill or $10 bill is worth $5 or $10 worth of goods and services, whatever they may be. There's no actual hard asset that backs up that money, that you could go in and trade that $5 or $10 bill for that asset, whatever it be. It used to be we were on the gold standard, so you could go to a bank with a $10 bill and request that they give you, in exchange for that $10 bill, $10 worth of gold, however many ounces that was. Used to be gold coins, so each coin was weighted based on the price of gold. It had $1 worth of gold in it. So you would get 10 of those for the $10 bill. We are no longer on the gold standard, and so the money is worth whatever it says on the face of the bill. That's what it's worth, and the only thing backing up that money is the government saying it's worth that. There's nothing, you go to the bank and tell them I want this amount in gold, they're going to tell you to go jump in the lake. They don't have it because we're not on the gold standard anymore. And quite honestly, $10 of gold would probably get you a tenth of an ounce at the price that it's at. It's like over $1,500 an ounce now. You couldn't even, I don't even think you could get a piece of gold leaf maybe for $10. That's about it. I'm going to next explain what the wealth of a nation is, because the video said inflation is when the government prints up more money than is justified by the nation's wealth. So what is the nation's wealth? So what I mean when I say nation's wealth is that a nation's wealth represents the value of all of its assets, both tangible and intangible. To calculate it, we start by determining the gross assets, which include tangible things, meaning real things, like real estate, businesses, cars, and financial assets, which are intangible. They're not things you can hold in your hands, such as bank deposits, stocks, and in financial markets. Then you subtract the outstanding liabilities, such as mortgages and debt, including the national debt. So the government keeps track of all of this information and comes up with a net worth. It's exactly the same formula you would use to determine your own personal net worth. One of the things that goes into determining a nation's wealth is gross national product. In the 18th century, an economist named Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And in that book, The Wealth of Nations, he talks about how a nation produces wealth. And a nation's wealth is determined by the ratio of what it produces to what it consumes. So gross national product is generally a statistic of what a nation produces, and the gross domestic product could kind of be considered what a nation consumes. And when you take that with the national debt, all the debts of Americans and all the assets of Americans, and you put all that stuff together and do the math, which I'm not good at doing math, that's why I studied history, you'll get the idea of what the national wealth is. So at this point in the podcast, I would like to explain what is meant by the word economy, like as in the nation's economy. And again, I'm going to rely on Investopedia for this. This is a great site, Investopedia.com, for you to learn all about financial things. And their definition of economy is that the economy is the total of all activities related to the production, sale, distribution, exchange, and consumption of limited resources by a group of people living and operating within it. Quoting Adam Hayes on Investopedia, broadly speaking, an economy is an interrelated system of human labor, exchange, and consumption. An economy forms naturally from aggregated human action, a spontaneous order much like language. Individuals trade with each other to improve their standards of living. Improved standards of living are made possible when labor is more productive. Productivity is driven by specialization, technological innovation, and working capital. And the only sustainable way for an economy to grow is through increased productivity. Now, very often the federal government will artificially cause the economy to grow by pumping more money into it. But that is not real economic growth. The government putting money into the economy is not genuine growth because it's not an increase in productivity. That is because the government is forcing an economic growth by putting more money out there for people to spend. It's like a gift from grandma for your birthday or a child's allowance, that they get money even though they didn't do anything productive to earn that money. So that's why it's not an increase in productivity and not true economic growth. Further, Mr. Hayes writes that to produce real productivity, an economy must have better tools and equipment, namely capital goods and greater specialization of laborers. It doesn't take a planned government effort to create an economy, but it does take a planned government effort to restrict and artificially mold it. All human beings are faced with resource scarcity and imperfect information. The economy of North Korea is very different from South Korea, despite a similar heritage, people, and set of resources. It's the public policy that makes their economy so distinct. It's why our economy is different than China's economy, different than Mexico's economy, different than Canada's economy, or any other economy. Each individual nation has its own economy that is determined by its public policy. Economies form when a variety of parties come together. You have households. That's the backbone of an economy. Households refer to individual consumers and their families, which drive economic activity through their consumption of goods and services. The financial decisions made by households, such as spending, saving, investing, collectively impact the overall economic health of the nation. On the other hand, households also contribute to the labor force. These are people providing the workforce that is essential for businesses to operate and produce the goods and services that one can buy. In an economic cycle, it's the compensation from participating in this labor force that allows household consumption. So, in essence, you go to work, you get paid, you go out and you spend that money with products and services, and then those companies that make those products and services have employees that make those for you to buy, and they pay their employees, who can then turn around and go out and spend. You get it? It's like a cycle, right? It's like a constant flowing cycle of economic activity, with the currency or the money being the blood in that economy. And as I have already mentioned, you get inflation or prices rising when the government starts printing money to pay out a lot of entitlements or help to other nations and so much. When the government spends more than is justified by the wealth of the nation, that is when you have this crippling inflation like we have today. Right, our national debt is so high, the government is basically paying more on the interest of the national debt than it is on all of the other things it funds. Now, I am one of the people that believes the government should not play a large role in the economy. Some people, usually progressives, feel governments play a key regulatory role. And in the United States, through fiscal policies, which are the policies related to taxation and government spending, and the monetary policies, which is related to interest rates and inflation, which is determined by the Federal Reserve, and governments influence economic stability. On top of this, governments also employ people, giving them an income source. Governments also have necessities they can demand from businesses across a range of goods and services. One of those government necessities is taxation. So for most of the United States history, there was always some type of tax on trade, which is called a tariff, or some kind of tax on businesses. Until 1913, there was no income tax on individual people. Now, during the Civil War, there was a little bit of income tax to help the Union Army to fund the war effort, pay for the goods, the armaments, pay the soldiers, buy the food for them. win the war against the Confederacy. So there was a little bit of an income tax then, but it was later repealed. And so at that point in history, everybody who worked or produced something, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, they all made money, and the government didn't take a single dime of it. They kept all of that money and in turn circulated that money, as I spoke about before, by purchasing other goods and services and trading with other people. When the government taxes people on their income, in effect, they're taking money out of the economy. They're taking it out of the hands of those households that are the backbone of the economy. They're taking that money away. That's money that would have been saved, invested, or spent on goods and services. They're taking that out of the economy for their own purposes. That's a way that the government can affect the economy. When taxes are higher, there's less money available to people to spend and generate economic growth. Taxes restrict economic growth, and that's a big political difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party wants high taxes with a government that kind of looks over everybody and takes care of them like a paternal father. Republicans generally are for lower taxes and for allowing people to keep more of their money so that those people can do what they want to do with their money, because generally people spend or save or invest their money in a much more sensible way than the government does. The government is full of bloated overspending and inefficiency of how the money gets spent and where it gets spent, how much of it gets spent. You've all heard of the $600 hammer for the Army, right, or the $1,000 toilet seat. The government just wastes money through its inefficiency or outright government corruption, crony politicians. So people can generally decide what to do with their money individually and then collectively together way better than the U.S. government. Another part of the economy is banks and financial institutions. An important part of a growing economy is the ability to capture credit. Consider an example of a small business wanting to launch but not having enough money. Banks facilitate the flow of money by providing financial services such as loans, savings accounts, and investment opportunities. A bank loans that small business, their owner, the capital to start that business. Another part of the economy are investors. Very similar to what banks do by facilitating capital, investors do the same. Investors influence economic activities and resource allocation by giving people money in the hopes that the money grows, meaning that whatever they buy or invest in is worth more when they go to sell it than what they bought it for. And the decisions of investors impacts asset prices, interest rates, and the overall efficiency of the financial markets. An economy forms when groups of people leverage their unique skills, interests, and desires to trade with each other voluntarily. And taxation by the government, whether it's the state, local, or federal, affects all of that investment. All those people who say if the wealthy just paid more in taxes, we'd be better off. If the wealthy just pay more. Well, the wealthy already pay a lion's share of the taxes, and there are a level of poor people who pay no taxes. So the majority of the tax bill falls on the middle class, right? The working poor. The wealthy can afford to have accountants and lawyers to strategically plan how they invest their money and avoid or minimize the amount of tax they owe. But at the same instance, they still pay a tremendous amount of tax by the fact that they are wealthy. Now, you have these people that say, oh, well, they just need to pay more. Well, they need to pay higher taxes. Well, every time, as I said earlier, when you increase taxes, you're taking that money out of the hands of the individuals or the system that will circulate that money, you're taking that away from them. You're slowing the economy down. You're reducing the amount of money that the wealthy can go then and invest. Okay, you need a wealthy class to have a successful, growing economy. This is something that the Democratic Party demagogues who shout, tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich, to gain votes from the poor, they understand this, they know this, but they don't inform the people that are voting for them of this. They keep it hidden from them. Because if they were to tell the truth, then they may not get elected. They use this tax the rich, this class warfare, as a method of staying in power or getting in power. Keep in mind that these are the people who are also making the tax laws and the tax policy. And every single person that works in Congress, that's a congressman, a senator, representative, all of those people are millionaires. Not one of them is what I would call a working poor person. I wouldn't even call them middle class. They are wealthy. Do you think they're going to pass laws and policies that make them give up more of their income? If you think that's true, if you believe in that the Democrat that you vote for is really looking out for you, the working class person, then, my friend, you are sadly mistaken, because they know the real deal. They know that taxes reduce economic spending, reduce the economy, hurt the economy, and they don't want to give up what they have built up because they are millionaires through investing. They're not going to create laws that hurt themselves. So what makes you think that them claiming that all we need is to tax the rich more is actually going to happen? When the tax code was created in 1913, it was 40 pages long. Now it is 40,000 pages long, because over the 100 years since it was created, all of these lawmakers put in all these little loopholes and things to help themselves and help their cronies, their wealthy donors, to avoid paying more taxes. Even though I still will say that the majority of the taxes are paid by the wealthy. But if you just eliminated all of those loopholes, if you created something like a flat tax, right? Let's agree to say claim 20%. Everybody pays 20% of their income and their assets. No complicated tax forms. The CPAs would be out of business, because you would get a simple form where you would put your net worth on it, you would put your net annual income, and then pay 20% on that. That's it. Now, if everybody pays 20%, including the poverty-stricken poor who don't pay anything now, well, if you only make $10,000 a year, which is below the poverty limit, then you're going to pay on 20%. You're only going to pay about $2,000 of that $10,000. But if you make $10 million a year, you're going to pay $2 million a year. And if you make $100 million a year, you're going to pay $20 million in taxes. You're going to pay more in taxes by the sheer percentage going up. And it's more fair because now the wealthy are paying more in taxes. There's no loopholes. Everybody just coughs up 20% of their income, or whatever amount you want to make it. Could be 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever you want to make it. That's a truly fair tax. The progressive income tax, ironically put in by progressives in 1913, screw the middle class. They screw the poor class. And they actually help the rich a little bit. Even though, as I said, the rich pay a large section of taxes, they still help the rich out a little bit more, and at the cost of hurting the middle class and the poor, the people who work hard for that dollar. That's money they can't reinvest or put into the economy through spending. That restricts economic growth. I can't make it any more simpler than that. If you still don't understand, then I don't know what to tell you. And while I'm discussing the progressive income tax, which was put in 1913 during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, a very famous progressive president, let me explain who came up with that idea of the progressive income tax, because incidentally, that was also the same law that created the income tax, created the Federal Reserve. All of that was put together by a cabal of bankers in this country. It was the bankers, people who were wealthy, who came up with this whole idea of a progressive income tax, who came up with the idea of the Federal Reserve. And keep in mind, the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. People don't seem to understand that the Federal Reserve is an actual private bank. Yes, it was created by the federal government. Yes, the president puts in some of the board members or the chairman, the chairman of the Fed. But a lot of the board members of the Fed are the CEOs of the member banks of the Fed, of which all the banks that operate in the United States are members of the Federal Reserve. They're forced to be. They have to be. By virtue of opening a bank in the U.S., you have to be a member of the Federal Reserve. Even if it's a foreign bank that operates in the United States, they have to be a member of the Federal Reserve. That's the law. They can't skirt the Federal Reserve because they are subject to Federal Reserve monetary policy, Federal Reserve regulations, because they regulate the banks and create the rules for banking. And the Federal Reserve is also the check clearinghouse. So when banks make transfers between banks, the Federal Reserve, it goes through their central clearing computers. There are 12 reserve districts, 12 Federal Reserve districts, and each one of those districts is in charge of all of the banks that are headquartered within that district or have branches in that district. And on your account, you have what's called a routing number. And the routing number identifies one bank from another. And then you have your account number. So as checks are written and payments are made and transfers go back and forth between banks, the bank that's controlling all of that movement of money is the Federal Reserve. They are the check clearinghouse. Federal Reserve reserve amounts, which is the amount that a bank has to keep in reserve in case all of the depositors of that bank decide today they want to go take their money out. The bank has to have the money to pay out all of those people wanting to withdraw their money. Or if they don't have that money, they can always contact the Federal Reserve and say, we need some more money because we got to run on our bank where everybody's coming and taking the money out. Not that that's happened since the Great Depression, but there is what they call a reserve limit, which all the banks have to maintain. When the banks get cash in, it comes from the Federal Reserve because the Federal Reserve is the bank that prints the money. They're the ones, every dollar bill that you have, every piece of currency you have says Federal Reserve note on it. It is not as much money as it is a promissory note that the Federal Reserve Bank is allowing you to borrow using their notes, their promissory notes, to pay for goods and services. It's a Federal Reserve note. It's realistically not even your money. It's their money. You're being paid in this bank's money. The Federal Reserve was a bad idea, and it's still a bad idea. But that was created by the progressives during 1913 with a progressive president, and here we are today. Now the economy's probably going to collapse because we've allowed the progressives to kind of take over the government. No, they haven't they did take over the government. And I forgot to mention that the Federal Reserve is the bank that also sets the monetary policy. So that means the interest rates that banks are allowed to charge is wholly and solely determined by the Federal Reserve. They determine how much interest each bank can charge, as well as them trying to control the inflation rate. That's what monetary policy means or is. So when you hear the term progressive, not only are you talking about people who are left of center, they're left of what we call conservatives, which is what I am, but they're also generally wealthy elitists who, in the name of doing good or benefiting society, believe the government has a role to make the lives of everyone better, taking the decision out of the individual people who would decide if their life is better or how to make their life better. These do-gooder progressives are elite people that think they know better than you, that they're educated and you're nothing but an ignoramus, and they know better than you. So let the government decide, let the government plan, and you just keep your mouth shut and go along with the program. This is essentially what FDR did in the 30s and 40s with the Great Depression and World War II. Until FDR, the idea of a liberal was kind of what today people call conservative. Liberals believed in individual freedom over the government. And when FDR came in, he redefined liberalism or liberal as freedom because of the government. Freedom from want, freedom from fear, his four freedoms. Because at heart, FDR was a Marxist. He was actually more in line with the communist thought process and the Marxist thought process, the socialist thought process, hence Social Security and all of the government spending for the WPA and the PWA and the Civilian Conservation Corps, all of that government spending he did, which actually extended the Great Depression. Great Depression would have probably ended sooner if Roosevelt didn't interfere with the economy. And what ultimately brought us out of the Depression, or made Roosevelt look like a success, was World War II. It had nothing to do with all of his central planning from the federal government. FDR changed the term liberal into what it is today, which is progressive or leftist. And what was once what they call a classical liberal is now a conservative, which is why I often say to define a conservative is a liberal who has been mugged. Mugged by the government or mugged by a criminal, but a liberal who's been mugged becomes a conservative. People like to use the term red pill based on the movie Matrix. They say, I've had my red pill moment. It just means that they've woken up, and not in the progressive idea of woke, and they have been mugged, and they have seen what has happened to them, and they don't like it. Progressives and leftists and Marxists, they couch their entire belief system on this idea of altruism. They truly believe, or at least I think they truly believe, that they are benefiting society as a whole. However, they don't. Generally, the more they interfere, the worse society gets, actually. Think of communism. Communism is a planned economy. It takes the idea of economic growth as being people trading for their own benefit to better their own lives. It takes that away from the people, right? I said economic growth is people volunteering to trade in order to better their own situation. When you have a centrally planned government economy, as you would under communism, nobody is voluntarily trading to improve their own life. They're trading involuntarily on the way that the government is telling them that they have to trade. The government is determining the method of production, how much gets produced. The government controls all of the production rates and creation and what gets created and where the money goes. All of that is government designed. That's why communism doesn't work. Does any of this actually sound familiar to you right now, where Joe Biden's government is deciding where the money is going to be spent? He has ruled against carbon processing, oil, shale, gas, all of that, in favor of electric cars, electric vehicles, electric charging stations, solar panels. In effect, the government has decided against what has worked for 200 years, a carbon-based economy, and they have decided that the way to go is electric motors, which are not as efficient as gasoline and oil-powered vehicles. That's a topic for another podcast. But who's deciding all of this? It's the president, Joe Biden, and the federal government is rewarding the electrical vehicle sector and hurting the carbon and oil and petroleum industry. That's all government decided. That's not that the consumers want the electric vehicles, because they don't. It's not the consumers deciding not to buy oil or gasoline. It's the government regulating and punishing the petroleum and carbon industries, which is why gas is $5 a gallon now, when under the Trump administration it was $1.50 or $2 a gallon. It's not the government's job to pick the winners and the losers in a capitalist economy. That's a planned economy. That's a government planned, central planned economy. That's socialism, that's Marxism, that's communism. And that's where we're headed if we don't reelect Donald Trump this November. The government deciding who wins and who loses, who benefits in the economy and who doesn't, does not promote economic growth. It not only doesn't allow for economic growth, but it actually stops economic growth. That is why, ultimately, the Soviet Union fell. And that is why the Chinese Communist Party does something that I like to call pragmatic communism. Yes, they are a communist country where the government controls and sets the rate of production and all the manufacturing in the country. But there's just enough limited capitalism that the Chinese have, mainly in Hong Kong and Shanghai and Macau. They allow a certain amount of capitalism to grow their economy, because the communism part is not growing their economy. It's just allowing them to control the masses. It's allowing them to control the economy. So they're using the limited capitalism, or what I call pragmatic communism, to grow the country economically, because they're smart enough to know that the communism isn't going to do that. But yet they're using the communism to restrict and control that amount of capitalism that is happening. They're severely keeping an eye on that capitalism. There are wealthy Chinese people that are allowed to keep their money, but a good lion's share of it goes back into the state. It funds the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese and the center-left progressives believe in big government, in government control, right? In central planning of the economy by the government. That's what progressives are, right? I mentioned that the Democratic Party believes in the idea of a paternal father who controls the economy, takes care of everyone, provides everyone with whatever they need. But those elites who get into the government or influence people who are in the government, those are your progressives, who think they know more than you, who think they know what you need to make your life better more than you do. This is one of the reasons why communism doesn't work. People there are not trading with each other voluntarily. They're trading with each other based on what the government tells them to trade on. People trade because they believe it makes them better off. Historically, a form of intermediation, which we call money, is introduced to make trade easier. Because before we had this intermediation, this idea of money, people would have to trade things. So it's like, well, I want to buy your cow. Well, what have you got to give me for the cow? Well, I got X amount of lumber that I've cut down. I can trade you whatever amount of lumber for your cow. Okay, that becomes very difficult because the person that owns the cow may not need lumber, right? Or may determine that the cow is worth more lumber than I think the cow is worth. So money makes this trade a little smoother because now we're not talking about trading lumber for cows. We're talking about how much the cow is going to cost me in money. Let's look at the U.S. during the colonial times. Agriculture was a fundamental economic activity, with subsistence farming prevalent in New England and middle colonies. Subsistence farming is farming that individual people do to feed their own family and feed themselves. And then they usually sell the excess to their neighbors or other people in the community. Large-scale plantations dominated in the southern colonies, particularly for crops like tobacco. This agricultural foundation not only sustained local communities, but also contributed to the broader colonial economy as the colonies could profit from what they were best at producing. Trade and mercantilist policies played an important role as the Navigation Acts imposed on the colonies by the Parliament in Great Britain. They imposed restrictions on colonial trade. These acts emphasized the export of raw materials to Britain, where they would be crafted into goods, and then the colonies would be forced to buy those goods only from Great Britain. That's what mercantilism is. This system created an economic dependency on British markets. Craftsmanship and skilled trades thrived in urban centers, contributing to the economic diversity. Cities like Boston and Philadelphia became hubs for skilled craftsmen, further shaping the economic landscape. Consider how this has helped shape society today. These large cities continue to bring workers together. It is also important to think through business opportunities and the ability to trade goods to different markets. So during the colonial period, there was something called triangular trade routes. And that meant that it connected the American colonies with Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. So for instance, sugar is grown in the Caribbean, be sent from the Caribbean to America to create molasses out of the sugar, which then would be sent to England to create products that went back to America and the Caribbean for people to buy. It moved goods, laborers, raw materials, and finished products. Without this wide-scale network, it would have been much more difficult for the U.S. economy to scale up without business partners and suppliers. So an individual laborer is more productive and worth more when they can more efficiently turn the resources into valuable goods and services. This could be everything from a farmer improving crop yields to a hockey player selling more tickets and jerseys. When a whole group of economic actors can produce goods and services more efficiently, it's called economic growth. Growing economies turn less into more faster. The surplus of goods and services makes it easier to achieve a certain standard of living. This is why markets reward those who produce the most value in the eyes of consumers. There are only a handful of ways to increase the real productivity. The most obvious is to have better tools and equipment, which economists call capital goods. The farmer with a tractor is more productive than the farmer with just a small shovel. But it takes time to develop and build capital goods, which requires savings and investments. Savings and investments increase when present consumption is delayed for future consumption. The financial sector, which is the banking and the markets, provide this function in modern economies. Another way to improve productivity is through specialization. So laborers improve the productivity of their skills and capital goods through education, training, practice, and new techniques. When the human mind better understands how to use human tools, more goods and services are produced and the economy grows, raising the standard of living. That's why we live today so much better than people did 100 years ago. So now let's look at the United States in the post-World War II era, which was a period of great economic growth, and it's referred to as the golden age of capitalism. This era was roughly spanning from the late 1940s to the early 1970s, which marked a significant expansion of the U.S. economy. First, the GI Bill, enacted in 1944, provided a range of benefits to returning veterans. This gave people education, housing, and business loans in an attempt to reintegrate millions of people back into civilization after fighting a war. This meant a more skilled workforce was needed, and that gave the more skilled workforce greater earning and spending capabilities. There was also a lot of substantial advancements in technology and innovation, such as manufacturing, aviation, and electronics. There was an expansion of the automobile industry and the rise of the television industry. This not only helped to create job opportunities because new jobs are being created. A television industry created a need for cameramen, sound people, jobs that didn't exist before those things were invented. Back in the 1850s, there was no TV, no radio. So there were no jobs that were radio man or cameraman or audio engineer. That's increased specialization. In the late 1950s, President Eisenhower initiated the construction of the interstate highway system. That also improved transportation and connectivity between cities and states, and it created jobs. In this sense, yes, the government activity was a driving force in the growth of the economy. But what happens when economic growth doesn't happen? An economy may not grow because there's a lack of investments, which happens when businesses are uncertain or don't have the capital to invest, or they lack confidence in the economic environment. When businesses hesitate to expand, it affects everything. It affects production, job creation, and overall economic activity. This investment extends to banks. When financial institutions tighten credit, it makes it harder for businesses to get money for growth. Policy-related problems also contribute to economies not growing. Poorly implemented or inconsistent economic policies, excessive regulations, and political instability can create a tough business environment, kind of what we're going through now under the Biden administration. Structural challenges within the economy, like poor infrastructure, that's our buildings, bridges, roads, an unskilled workforce, such as millions of migrants coming across the border, or outdated technology, are barriers to growth. Without a strong workforce or proper infrastructure that allows goods to be properly produced and traded, it may be inefficient or prohibitively expensive to scale a business. Then you have geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, and global economic downturns. Trade disruptions can impact export-oriented economies. National disasters can prevent goods from being moved from one location to another or being manufactured for sale. Thank you to Adam Hayes, who wrote the article that I was extensively quoting from on Investopedia. One of these economic markers that's very important to economists and the Federal Reserve and people in the government is gross national product, or GNP. And of course, Investopedia has a great little video on it, so stay tuned.
Gross national product, GNP, is one of the many metrics economists use to measure a country's economic output. For any 1 year, GNP equals the market value of all the goods and services produced by the citizens of a country, whether those goods were produced inside the country or manufactured elsewhere. Although similar, gross national product is not the same as the more frequently used gross domestic product, GDP. The difference between the two is that gross domestic product is the total of all economic output within a country's borders without distinction between foreign or domestic ownership, while gross national product looks only at citizenship and ignores where the goods were produced. Because of this, GDP and GNP are typically close in number, but not exactly the same. In countries with many foreign investors, the GDP can be quite a bit higher than the GNP. While both GDP and GNP are important indicators of a nation's economic productivity, the U.S. Department of Commerce switched from using the GNP to the GDP as their primary measure of the United States' economic well-being. This makes it easier to compare the U.S. economy to other nations, as the GDP is used by the majority of countries throughout the world.
Gross domestic product is all the economic activity within just the U.S., not counting in imports. It also, so in other words, if you buy a new car, that's going to be figured into the GNP, but if you buy a used car, that will not be in the GNP because it's not a new good that was produced. You're buying a previously produced thing, a used car. That economic activity will be in the GDP, but it won't be in the GNP because that car, the year it was produced, was in the GNP of that year. Okay, so I've talked about inflation and how when the government spends money, it creates inflation, especially because it's an artificial growth of the economy, not based on productivity, but based on the government plugging money into the economy. But let's talk about what money is. You've heard me mention the Fed and the tax thing from 1913, the act that created them, and let's talk about what our money actually is. There was a time when, and you've heard me mention it, where you could go into a bank with a $10 in paper money and get a $10 gold piece. There was actually a period of history, and you see this in a lot of Westerns, where people used gold coins and silver coins, but mainly gold coins, gold pieces, to buy things. There wasn't a national currency until probably 1910 or so. Before that, it was all banks issuing their own currencies. And in fact, greenbacks comes from the money that was issued by the Union during the Civil War. But at any rate, yeah, there wasn't really a national currency. All the banks issued their own bills, their own paper currency, and that led to problems because you would have currency from a bank in Philadelphia that, the guy in Georgia wouldn't take that as currency, right? And Georgia would have currency that Pennsylvania wouldn't take. So eventually that led to the formation of a national paper currency. But up to that point, before the paper currency thing, it was all people buying and trading with gold dust or gold coins mainly. And in fact, you've heard of like the pirates and pieces of 8, right? Or doubloons. Doubloons were Spanish minted gold coins that people would break up into 8 smaller pieces, like a pie, like a pizza pie, right? Small little triangular pieces. He would break it up into 8, hence the name pieces of 8. And when you've heard the expression, shaving a haircut, 2 bits, they mean 2 bits, 2 of those little bits of the pieces of 8. So the balloon, I don't remember the exact amount of it, but let's say it's $1. So 1 piece of 8 would be 1/8 of $1, which incidentally, I'm not sure if it's still this way, but historically the stock exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, does their pricing, stock pricing in increments of 1/8 because of that. So you might see a price of a share at 63 1/8 or 85 4/8, right? Whatever. They did 1/8 of $1, I believe, is 0.125, if I remember correctly. It's been a while. So that's what the money was. We were on a gold standard, and then in the late 1870s, 80s, 90s, we were on a bimetal standard, which was gold and silver. And then at some point, the government decided we were going to end the gold standard. And during World War II and the Depression, FDR wanted to get all of that gold out of people's hands, and I will do another podcast one day explaining why they did that. But you'll see on these commercials for like Mint, Franklin Mint or whatever, and they'll be talking about how a lot of these gold double eagles were destroyed, and we've got a few of them here that escaped somehow, that were in people's attics or basements, right? That they didn't turn them in because everybody was required to turn in their gold pieces to the federal government. They confiscated all that gold, and subsequently we were removed from the gold standard, although I think that didn't happen until well into the 70s. I'm going to have to look that up, and then I'll present that on the rest of this podcast. But what we have currently, what I do know for sure and what I can talk about, is the money we have, and I believe I've mentioned this earlier, is fiat money, which means there is nothing guaranteeing that a $10 bill or 20 or 100 or 50 or 5 or a 1, those are the denominations, right? 1, 5, 10, 20, 50, and 100, and every once in a while you'll find a $2 bill. There's nothing guaranteeing that those bills are worth the amount that's printed on them, except the faith that the United States government says this bill is worth that. There's nothing actually backing up. That's not what you would call hard currency. It's soft currency. It gets traded on the currency markets that trade various currencies against one another, which depends on the individual economies of the countries. In China's case, they artificially inflate their currency. Same thing with the European Union. They generally, whatever the dollar goes for, they make their euro about 1-to-1. It's not a hard currency based on anything except that the purchasing power of the dollar when you're going overseas is based on the currency trade rate, and within the United States, the bills are only worth what they are worth because the federal government says this is a $10 bill, it's worth $10 of goods and services. Now, inflation has made the purchasing power of that $10 bill probably about $5. That's another issue which I already talked about. I'm going to now talk about why we went off the gold standard and something that a lot of people are calling the silent depression. That's coming up next.
Almost 2,600 years ago, the first gold coins were minted and used for trade. Later on, people started storing their gold in well-guarded vaults and bought goods and services using the receipts given to them by those running the vaults. Pieces of paper they could always exchange for real gold. That's how paper money first appeared, and things evolved from there. Initially, most currencies were pegged to gold directly, as the name gold standard suggests. People could walk into a bank and exchange a piece of paper money to gold. After 1945, however, this changed, Currencies were pegged to the dollar, which was pegged to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. Individuals were no longer allowed to exchange paper money to gold, but central banks were. However, countries such as France ended up no longer trusting the US dollar and started converting their dollars to physical gold. The gold reserves of the US were getting depleted quickly, so President Nixon stopped allowing that. He took the United States, and thereby the world, off anything even resembling a gold standard in 1971. At this point, the money we use isn't backed by anything tangible. Fiat currencies, as they're called, are basically backed by confidence. The dollar is backed by the confidence people have in the US, the British pound by people's confidence in the UK, and so on. The value of one currency compared to another, therefore, fluctuates continuously. Confidence-driven supply and demand, if you will.
Okay, so there you have it. That little minute-long video explained the gold standard and why we're not on it anymore, because we were trading away all of our gold from our central bank to France's central bank and other central banks of other countries. What they don't talk about, though, in that video is one of the reasons why it's beneficial to have our currency on a gold standard. And I have another video I'll play that's about a minute or a minute and a half long, where the Federal Reserve, economist at the Federal Reserve, defends the fact that we're not on the gold standard and why we shouldn't be. One of the facts about being on a gold standard is because the price of gold is fixed and more stable, it would also limit the amount of money that government can spend. It's very limiting to the government. So when you have these boondoggles that I talked about, where the government would spend trillions of dollars on something, and then the Fed just prints up money to pay for those things, it causes inflation to rise because it's artificially growing the economy. The economy is not growing due to productivity, the natural growth of an economy. It's growing to this artificial money being pushed into the economy by the federal government. So you wouldn't be able to do that. The government couldn't do that under a gold standard. And so that's why I'm a proponent of putting the country back on a gold standard or bimetal standard, where you're including silver in that, because that gives you just a little bit of more flexibility than just being on gold. And in fact, I think they should even consider other precious metals like platinum and possibly even tungsten, some type of a metal standard, although tungsten is not considered a precious metal. So next video will be the Federal Reserve's answer to why we shouldn't be on the gold standard. So you'll have both sides of the argument, fair and balanced.
Money, whether gold coins or paper bills, is only valuable because of the goods and services we can buy with it. This is a key concept for evaluating the policy implications of the gold standard.
A desirable property of any monetary instrument is that it holds its value over short periods of time. So holds its value, its purchasing power. What determines the purchasing power of gold, or any other money for that matter? Well, economists like to think of the purchasing power of the various objects as being determined by the supply and the demand for those objects. So the purchasing power of money is how many goods one unit of money can buy. For example, suppose a soda costs $2. We say that the price of the soda is $2. But alternatively, what is the purchasing power of $1? It's half a soda. So the purchasing power of money represents how many real goods and services you can acquire in the market with one unit of money.
In terms of politics, the idea of returning to the gold standard is very controversial. However, among the broad spectrum of economists, nearly all agree that a return to the gold standard would not be a wise policy. So given that fact, what do backers of the gold standard view as its primary benefits?
Proponents of the gold standard like to emphasize at times is the idea that by linking the money supply to gold, that this somehow provides the economy with what they call a nominal anchor to the price level. That is to say, the price level or the purchasing power of money remains stable over long periods of time. And the reason they say this is they have in mind that the demand for gold is basically growing at some natural rate, say the rate of growth of the economy, and the supply of gold is just naturally limited because people have to go out and mine gold as opposed to just printing out paper. So this natural limitation on the supply of gold is what keeps the purchasing power of gold stable over long periods of time, according to these advocates. If the purchasing power of money rises, the cost of good goes down relative to this money. If the supply of that object is fixed, as it would be under a gold standard, and if the demand for that object fluctuates, as the demand for money appears to do, this implies that the purchasing power of your money will fluctuate from day to day. Just recently, for example, after a run-up in its value, the purchasing power of gold dropped by 10% in a single day. How would you feel having gone to work for wages in gold one day, and the next day watching the purchasing power of your gold wages drop by 10%? Alternatively, imagine that you go out to go shopping. You wish to buy some clothes, and you spend your hard-earned gold on the clothes just to watch your spent gold the next day rise in value by 10%. This would be very frustrating.
Okay, so that was the Federal Reserve economist explaining why we shouldn't be on a gold standard. And I love how in the video they said that the majority of economists think it would be a bad idea to be back on the gold standard. And that's not necessarily true. Also, his argument really doesn't hold weight by his own statements, right? He said the purchasing power of gold would give you more purchasing power if you tied the dollar to it. He actually said that because the purchasing power of gold would be more stable. Now, as a downside, they cite an example where the value of gold dropped by 10% in one day. And they imply that, that one day, the money you made is now worth less. Gold fluctuates daily. That is true. But over time, gold has gone up. So yes, your gold may drop in one day 10 or 15 or even 20%. But by the next day, it would probably recover that 10% or 20%. It might go up a little bit higher than it was. But the market generally winds up stabilizing the gold. The gold market stabilizes naturally. It's disingenuous for him to then say, so the gold dropped today 10% in one day, now your money is worth less. He explains perfectly why the gold standard is a good thing, is that it ties the money to some fixed asset. And this is very limiting to the government. So if you're into a government that you believe should be very limited in spending and not running itself into a constant state of debt, our government for the last 20 years has pretty much increased the debt. And now it's at 130 or 140% of GDP. This is unsustainable. Our economy is probably going to collapse if we don't get a handle on this national debt. Now, don't confuse the national debt with the national deficit. That's something the media likes to do. The deficit is the spending, the daily spending or the yearly spending. So you'll hear somebody say, well, we're going to, take care of this, balancing this budget, right, and not doing this deficit. So Congress will project that they were going to spend 20% more next year on all of its programs. But if we cut back 10%, we're saving money, right? We're cutting the deficit. Yeah, but you're still spending 10% over what your budget, okay? They're not balancing the budget. They're just agreeing to spend less than they planned on spending. And every year, the government operates at a deficit. They very rarely have ever ended up with a surplus, although during the Clinton years there was a few surpluses. However, the surpluses were not used to then pay off the debt. See, so think of deficit spending as you going out and having a grand old time using your credit cards. You are, in effect, overspending, not based on your income, but on your credit. And while you're doing this, you're increasing your debt load. And as credit cards, as you know, if you have them, they have very high interest rates. And if you just make the minimum payments, yes, you'll keep your credit rating good, but you'll never get that debt paid off. And that's kind of what the U.S. government is doing. Putting us on a gold standard will severely limit the amount of spending the government can do. And that's why most people like me feel it's a good thing. Further proof that the gold standard is a good thing is in an article in Forbes magazine, which is a business-centered economic magazine, and the writer of the article is Nathan Lewis, and the article is from 2021. And it says, the historical record is clear. Countries that have currencies based on gold tend to do very well. Those that don't usually run into difficulties. The United States had a dollar based on gold with some lapses from 1789, that's the year our country was founded, to 1971, and became the wealthiest and most successful country in the world. Soon after the U.S. gold standard era ended on August 15, 1971, someone asked the 31-year-old economist Arthur Laffer what he thought the outcome would be. Quote, "It won't be as much fun to be an American anymore," end quote, he reportedly said. Some people today still ask, WTF happened in 1971? Laffer had it all figured out. If you want to understand why things work out this way and why Arthur Laffer could make a prediction like that and be right, you have to understand the principle of stable money. It's very simple. Money is best when it is stable in value. It doesn't go up or down in value as might be expressed in the foreign exchange market. Today, Turkey's currency, the lira, has been falling in value, and we generally look at this as a bad thing. Why is that? Because we don't want currencies to go up in value either. That would make debts harder and harder to repay until eventually there was a wave of defaults. That's not fun. And notice, Federal Reserve economist, he's talking about we need a money that's flexible for changes daily, for short term. Completely wrong. We do not need a money that changes for short term changes. We need a money that's stable over long term, which is exactly what he said when the money was tied to a gold standard. It's kind of undermined his own argument, in my opinion. But the Forbes article further states, on a more subtle note, a stable currency is like a measuring rod that doesn't change length. A stable measuring rod of value allows us to interact in the market economy effectively. The information contained in prices, which guide all aspects of the monetary economy, is not corrupted by changes in the currency itself. This idea was expertly elucidated by George Gilder in The Scandal of Money, 2016. Or as Arthur Laffer later said, quote, monetary policy specific purpose should be to provide a stable, valued currency both now and far into the future, end quote. The early economist David Ricardo said nearly the same thing in 1816. Quote, a currency to be perfect should be absolutely invariable in value, end quote. As opposed to what the Fed economist was saying, how we need a currency that's flexible for small short-term changes. This is why most countries today have a simple, stable value policy. Generally, that is artificially stated because a lot of countries are off on the gold standard because we're not on the gold standard, and they base their value of their money on the US dollar, or at least they used to. Now, with China's hegemony, the yuan and the Russian ruble are becoming more of the standard bearers that people judge their own money's worth. And the dollar is not considered reliable anymore for obvious reasons, right? We're in a shitty economy, and we've been in one since Joe Biden took office, and we were in a shitty economy before Trump took office in 2016. In effect, these countries have lost confidence in the dollar, and yet it's kind of a cabal, right? The fact that it's Russia and China, which both artificially stabilize their money. It's not based on gold. It's just they say this is what it's worth, and this is what we're going to leave it at, and it's not going to change. You can have your financial market all you want. This is it. This is what we're determining is the value of our dollars. You can do whatever you want with every other country's dollars or money. They don't have dollars. They have yuan and rubles. But this is what we're going to say ours is worth. So usually, to quote to continue with the article, usually they link their currencies to the dollar or euro either tightly or loosely. That's what I just said. Sometimes we lament that they do not execute this policy with as much skill as we would like, but nevertheless, that's the basic idea. They learn that the effects of unstable money are bad enough that they should be avoided. Probably you rarely hear any discussion about stable value as some kind of ideal, even though most countries in the world are doing it right now. The major central banks do not seem to hold this idea at all, as evidenced by the Fed economist, right? They don't believe in a stable value. And they aren't even trying to achieve stable value. Not surprisingly, they never achieve it, and this has consequences. We live in an era of floating fiat currencies. These currencies' values are supposed to go up and down by design. Key word, by design. Central banks never talk about fixing this problem. Instead, they talk about something else, manipulating the macroeconomy through some kind of currency and interest rate distortion. They talk about this incessantly. And the problem with this is by the time they react and do whatever their change in monetary policy is to fix the economy, it's too late because now the economy has moved on. So they're always reacting instead of proacting. The whole idea of a currency stable value is that it is neutral. It does not distort commerce like a meter or a kilogram that doesn't change length or weight. The whole idea of a floating fiat currency is that it does distort commerce. All those countries that link their currencies to the dollar or euro are effectively giving up floating fiat currencies. Their currencies don't float. They are fixed in value to an external benchmark of value, the dollar or euro. Thus, they are depoliticized. A gold standard is the same idea. Currencies' values are linked to gold, an external standard of value. We do not assume that gold is a perfectly unchanging measure of this idea of stable value, but after centuries, actually millennia, of experiencing these matters, we have determined two things. It is good enough. Whatever variation gold may have against this idea of stable value, it has not been large enough to matter very much. It works very well. As I said, throughout millennia, gold has always increased in value. And even though it's had some dips and drops and collapses, it always rebounds and becomes worth more than it was in the past. Kind of like the stock market, right? It's had crashes, it's had severe depressions and drops, but it always kind of rebounds. And the stock market is much more valuable now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and even 100 years ago. And two, the second thing is that there is no better alternative. Nobody has found some measure of stable value that is superior to gold. Gold has what we might call political advantages. Let's say a bunch of the eggheads at the Federal Reserve came up with some statistical concoction that they claim is even more stable in value than gold. Well, this has never happened because they don't even try. Let's make believe that it is not impossible, although it looks impossible, but actually happened. Then what? The statistical concoction, no matter how wonderful it was, would immediately be subject to political pressures. One way or another, there would be attempts to somehow adjust the outcome to affect the macroeconomy, before an election, for example. If you look at the continuous stream of revisions of the consumer price index that have taken place, it's hard to imagine any statistical concoction that would be subject to a similar continuous process of revision to serve a continual series of agendas. Second, other countries would be hesitant to adopt this. They would be, in effect, declaring a sort of political allegiance, which could be risky, as we have seen in the Eurozone. Gold is the one standard that everybody has been able to agree on in the past because it is not the property of one government, of any one government. Every government has gold reserves, usually stored at the Federal Reserve Bank in Manhattan. It is easy to see why today's most popular cryptocurrencies cannot serve as a measure of stable value. Their values are not stable at all, but fluctuate wildly. However, you could certainly include today's crypto innovations into your gold standard system. Already, some stablecoin cryptocurrencies have been developed that are linked to gold, including Tether Gold, Kinesis Gold, and Coro. Money is a tool like a hammer. We make hammers out of steel because a steel hammer best approaches what we want the hammer to be, hard and heavy. We made money out of gold because gold best approaches what we want money to be, stable in value. You can see this because we assume that money is stable in value even when we know that it is not. For example, when the price of oil goes from $70 to $80 a barrel, we assume the value of oil went up 14% as measured in a money of stable value. We do not assume that the value of the currency fell 13% while oil remained stable, although that might be what actually happened. This is called the money illusion. It's actually one thing that makes macroeconomic manipulation via floating currencies effective. People assume their money is stable in value, although actually they are floating fiat currencies. This is how central bankers like the Fed fool people to do things, invest, borrow, spend, hire, that they would not do if the currency was stable in value. When you come to understand that money should be stable in value, free from human intervention, and you realize that linking the value of money to gold has always been the best way to achieve this goal, then there is no other conclusion but a gold standard system. Thank you to Nathan Lewis and Forbes magazine for perfectly stating the obvious benefit of putting the U.S. economy back on the gold standard, and as I mentioned, would also limit the amount of spending the federal government can do. Now, the next topic that I mentioned is the silent depression and what this is. And I have some statistics that will explain it, along with a little video.
We are in a silent depression. When you compare the Great Depression to today, this is going to absolutely blow your mind. In 1930, during the Great Depression, the average home in America was $3,900. The average car was $600, and the average monthly rent was $18 or $216 a year, and the average salary was $1,300 for the year. Fast forward to today, it is $436,000 for the average home, $48,000 for the average car, and the average rent is $2,000 a month or $24,000 a year, and we have a $56,000 income for the average American right now. So if you look back to the Great Depression, the house was only 3 times the average salary. Now it is 8 times the average salary. The car was 46% of the salary. The car today is 85% of the salary. And here's the craziest part. The rent was 16% of the average salary. It is now 42% of the average salary.
Okay, you heard that little video where he gave you the numbers from 1930 during the height of the Great Depression and today. And I wanted to put this in a little bit more different context because it's not quite clear by what he's saying. He's using percentages, 3 times this and 48% of that. So I like to put it this way. The average American individual in 1930 brought in an annual income of about $4,800. That's equivalent to $87,000 today. But yet the average salary in America is about $57,000, not $87,000. A new car was averaged around $860, which is equivalent to $15,000 today. But as of 2023, the average cost of a new car was $48,000. Gas was 10 cents a gallon in 1930, which is equivalent to $1.79 today. But gas is averaging almost $4 in 2023. The average American home, it was $3,900 in 1930, which adjusted for inflation and cost of living is about $70,000. But yet the average home today, based on current market value, is over $460,000. So instead of giving you percentages, which are good, I'm giving you a more obvious comparison. What I really don't understand is how, regardless of what your politics are, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whether you're conservative or liberal, nobody is discussing this. Nobody in Congress is discussing this. Now, what made me wake up and listen to this, because there are plenty of videos of people debunking the silent depression theory. It's a theory. It's not really proven. But I think it's a pretty solid theory. And I haven't really watched any of the videos debunking it. Maybe I should. But here's why I tend to believe in the silent depression theory. When you look at your grandparents in the 1950s and before, your grandparents owned a home, had a car, ate well, clothed their kids, all on the salary of one earner, the husband. The husband usually went out to work, and the wife stayed home to take care of the kids and keep house. Now, I don't want to get into a whole feminist argument about patriarchy and all of that. The point is that's the way it was. Whether you think that's right or not doesn't matter. Okay, the point is that at one time in America, most households had one income earner, usually the father, the husband. And yet they were able to afford a home, eat well, clothe their kids, enjoy their lives, go on vacation, own a home, own a car, maybe even 2 cars, pay for their insurance, pay for their medical bills, all of that. Everybody was doing well with one income. Show me the person or the family or the household that can do that today. Even among high-earning people, the majority of households have mom and dad both working just to make ends meet. That's something I have observed with my own eyes. So all of these videos that debunk the idea that we're worse off than the Great Depression, it doesn't hold water to me, because I grew up in the 70s in a period when there was high inflation, but yet life had just at that point still been on the tail end of the one income household. By the 70s, women had already entered the workforce in the late 50s, throughout the 60s, and into the 70s. That's like the period when women began to really enter the workforce in big amounts in offices and so forth. And during that high inflation period is when you started to notice people having to both work. And I myself was a latchkey kid, meaning I had a key to my house and I would come home and the place was empty. There was no mom to cook me dinner or take care of me, right? I had to learn to take care of myself, basically. Fortunately, I've been cooking since I'm 5, so I can cook my own dinner. this is something I observed. And when you watch old TV shows like Leave It to Beaver and things from the 60s and 70s, you kind of see this. Yes, even in the time of Leave It to Beaver, that show was idealized. Okay, most families weren't so hunky-dory where there was some problem and by the end of the show the problem was solved, right? TV has always been a bit more idealistic and starry-eyed than reality, because nobody wants to turn on TV and see reality. Even reality shows today are not really reality. They're somewhat scripted and edited for whatever narrative the producers want to show. They're only real or reality in the sense that they're not necessarily casted with professional actors, completely, totally scripted. It's not actors who've memorized the script and are reading. It's a little bit more ad-libbing. It's more where the director and writers of the show come up with scenarios and they tell the people, or they put the people in situations where they react to whatever the scenario is. Like when you think of a show like Survivor, this is getting off topic a little bit, but it is something I want to point out, right? And you're seeing these people on Survivor and other places, they're suffering, they're starving, right? All they got is rice to eat. Well, stop and think for a minute. You're watching them by use of a camera. What you don't see with the starving, hungry people is there's a cameraman right there with a camera. So how starving and hungry can they be? How bad a shape can they be when they got a cameraman right there? And the cameraman isn't suffering all that deprivation that they are. Cameraman's not on the show, not competing for the money. The camera crew is there to film these supposedly poor, struggling people, and they do struggle a bit. I mean, obviously, it's a real situation in that way. It's a show. It's a TV show. There are camera crews. There's sound people, right? Off camera, you're not seeing the boom mic that they're holding above the people to catch their voices. They like to do these confessionals, and they like to do these, like, showing the people going off in a corner, 2 or 3 people going off in a corner and whispering and plotting against the other group of people. How quiet or how secret is that planning when they got a camera crew filming it with a boom mic guy, catching the voices and all of that? It's nonsense. It's entertaining, but it's nonsense. They're not, and I've even seen instances on Survivor where someone got hurt, and then the next thing you know, a helicopter's racing in to chopper them out to a hospital. Even reality TV is not really real. When you watch old television shows, they are reflective, or they are showing what society was like. No, the average American's life was probably not as hunky-dory, perfect as June and Ward Cleaver and their 2 kids. But the show does accurately reflect that households in the 50s and 60s were like that, with June staying home, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the kids, and Dad, Ward Cleaver, going out and earning the money to pay for it all. That's kind of the way it was, even if the TV show is somewhat idealized. Actually, very idealized, not even somewhat. So when you look at that, as I do as a historian, I'm very big into social history, how people lived. And then you look at today, I don't care what anybody debunking the silent depression is. I've seen it for myself. I have lived it. And when he said in that video that rents are 48% of the income, here in New York City, that's a given. In fact, I would venture a guess that the rents here in New York City are more than 50%, probably closer to 60% of a person's income, when it should only be, according to every good economics, home economics, or financial advisor, tells you your rent and utilities and everything, your living expenses shouldn't be more than 30% of your income. There is nobody, and I mean nobody, in New York City, short of being a multimillionaire, whose living expenses are 30% of their income. Everybody is paying 50% and above. Vast majority of people in New York and a vast majority of people in the country generally, but especially in places like New York, Boston, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, all these major cities, those people are paying upwards of 50% or more on living expenses. So that's all I've got for you today, and thank you for listening, and I hope to see you next time where we share another slice of my life. And please share and if you like it, please share it and get your friends to listen. And if you want to contact me, you can contact me at robbenn69@yahoo. That's ROBBENN69@yahoo. And if you feel like contributing to help me out with the podcast, feel free to contact me there and I will tell you how to do it. Thanks again. Be well. Till next time, this is Bennett's Slice of Life.